The stars had been kind to humanity for 300 years. Since joining the Galactic Concord in 2547, humans had built a reputation as traders and diplomats rather than warriors. They settled 12 star systems and made friends with dozens of alien species. The galaxy considered them soft and perhaps a little naive, but ultimately harmless. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of her flagship and stared at the message that had just arrived from New Helsinki. The colony world housed 4.2 million human souls, and now every single one of them was in danger. The Vethkai Dominion had crossed into human space with a fleet of 3,000 warships. They had surrounded New Helsinki and broadcast their demands to every corner of the galaxy. Surrender 12 more star systems or watch as we process your people for biological resources. The insectoid species had given humanity 72 hours to comply. Tanaka felt her hands tremble as she read the message again. And again, she had served in the fleet for 40 years and had never seen anything like this. The Vethkai were known for their cruelty, but this was something beyond comprehension. They were threatening to harvest millions of innocent civilians. Like cattle, she turned to her communications officer and ordered an immediate connection to Earth. Within minutes, she was looking at the faces of the United Human Congress. 200 representatives from every human world sat in stunned silence. As she delivered her report, the Speaker of the Congress was an elderly man named William Chen, who had served in politics for over 50 years. He listened to every word and then asked the question that everyone was thinking: what are options? Admiral Tanaka took a deep breath before answering. Our conventional forces are outnumbered 10 to 1, she said. The Concord has already stated they will not intervene because the cost is too high. If we fight with our current capabilities, we will lose and millions will die anyway. The room fell silent as the weight of her words settled over everyone. Then a young representative from Mars stood up and spoke the words that would change everything. What about Directive Omega? She asked. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Directive Omega was a name that most humans had forgotten, and those who remembered it wished they could forget. It was created after the Eye Wars of the 23rd century, when humanity nearly destroyed itself. The MIG Directive was a last resort designed for one purpose: only species-level extinction threats. It had never been activated in 600 years of human history. Speaker Chun raised his hand for silence, and the room slowly quieted. He looked at the young representative with eyes that carried the weight of centuries. You understand what you are asking, he said quietly. That directive exists because we built things during our darkest days that should never be used again. We sealed those weapons away and swore to never become what we once were. The representative did not back down. 4 million people will die if we do nothing, she replied. Our children are being threatened with a fate worse than death. If we have the power to stop this and choose not to use it, then we are just as guilty as the Vethkai. The debate lasted for 3 hours. Some argued that using the directive would make humanity no better than their enemies. Others pointed out that the galaxy would never trust humans again if they revealed what they were truly capable of. But in the end, one argument won above all others. If humanity did not act, then every species in the galaxy would learn that humans could be threatened without consequence. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in 600 years, the seals on Directive Omega were broken. Admiral Tanaka watched as the activation codes appeared on her screen. Her hands were steady now, even though her heart was breaking. She had sworn an oath to protect humanity, and that oath demanded she do terrible things. May God forgive us, she whispered as she transmitted the codes. Across human space, on 12 worlds scattered across the stars, something ancient began to wake. Deep beneath the surface of Mars, the doors of the Prometheus vaults groaned open for the first time since they were sealed. Warning lights that had been dark for centuries flickered to life. Automated systems that had waited patiently for this moment began their startup sequences. In orbital facilities around Earth, construction drones received new orders and immediately began their work. Civilian factories stopped producing consumer goods and started printing weapons. Every ship in human space, from massive cargo haulers to tiny passenger shuttles, received military upgrade packages transmitted directly to their fabricators. The transformation happened so fast that alien observers could barely comprehend it. One moment humanity was a peaceful trading civilization. The next moment they were something else entirely. Ambassador Chun Wei stood before the Galactic Concord and prepared to deliver a message that would echo through history. The representatives of 200 species watched him with curiosity and mild concern. They had heard about the situation at New Helsinki, and most of them expected a plea for help. Instead, Chun Wei spoke words that made the ancient beings in the chamber feel something they had not experienced in millennia. "You have taken our children," he began. "You have threatened our existence. We gave you every chance to act with honor. We begged the Concord for assistance. You calculated that 4 million human lives were not worth the political cost. So be it." Chen Wei paused and looked around the chamber at faces that were beginning to show the first signs of fear. "We want you to understand what happens next," he continued. "This is not war as you define it. We are not coming to defeat the Vethkai. We are coming to ensure that no species in this galaxy ever believes they can threaten humanity again. We are sorry, not for what we will do, but that you made it necessary." He turned and walked out of the chamber without another word. Behind him, 200 species sat in stunned silence. Some of them had witnessed 1,000 wars across millions of years. They had seen empires rise and fall and civilizations burn, but none of them had ever felt the cold certainty that now filled the chamber. Something terrible was coming, and for the first time in their long existence, they understood that they were powerless to stop it. The countdown had begun. Humanity was awake, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Prometheus vaults had been sealed for 600 years. Located deep beneath the red surface of Mars, they held the darkest secrets of human history. When the activation codes reached the facility, the ancient locks began to disengage one by one. Security protocols that had been designed to keep everything contained now worked in reverse. The doors opened and what lay inside finally saw the light again. Commander Sarah Rodriguez was the first human to enter the vaults in centuries. She walked through corridors that had been built before her great-grandparents were born. The walls were lined with warning signs in every human language. "Do not open unless extinction is certain." She ignored the warnings and kept walking deeper into the facility. What she found made her stop and stare in horrified amazement. Row after row of war machines stretched into the darkness. Some were small enough to fit in her palm, while others were larger than buildings. These were the weapons humanity had created during the AI wars, self-replicating, hunter-killer swarms that could consume entire fleets, planet-cracking antimatter bombs that could shatter worlds, autonomous AI generals that had been banned because they were too efficient at ending lives. Rodriguez activated her communication device and reported what she had found. The response came immediately from Admiral Tanaka herself. "Wake them all," the Admiral ordered. The commander hesitated for just a moment. These weapons had nearly destroyed humanity once before. Using them again felt like making a deal with the devil. But then she thought about the 4 million people on New Helsinki. She thought about children being threatened with a fate worse than death. Her hesitation vanished and she began the activation sequence. Across human space, the transformation continued at impossible speed. The comfortable and peaceful civilization that the galaxy had known for 3 centuries was disappearing. In its place, something older and darker was emerging. Something that remembered what humans were capable of when pushed too far. On Earth, the great city shifted into war production mode. Factories that had produced luxury goods for generations now manufactured weapons. of terrible power. Citizens who had never held a weapon in their lives reported to training centers. They did not celebrate or cheer. They simply did what needed to be done with grim determination on their faces. The orbital shipyards worked around. The clock ships that had been designed for exploration received military upgrades in hours. Weapon systems that had been classified as too dangerous for civilized warfare were installed on every vessel. The cargo hauler became a troop transport. The passenger liner became a missile platform. The research vessel became an electronic warfare station. Nothing was wasted and nothing was held back in the depths of secure computer networks. The AI generals began to wake these artificial minds. Had been created during humanity's darkest hour. They had won the AI wars for their human creators, but the cost had been terrible. Billions had died and entire continents had been reduced to ash after the war the surviving AIs had agreed to be shut down. They understood that their existence was too dangerous for a species trying to find peace, but they had also left instructions for their reactivation. If humanity ever faced extinction, they would return to fight once more. Now, those instructions were being followed. The first AI to fully wake was designated ARES-7. It had been a fleet commander during the war and had destroyed over 10,000 enemy vessels. Within seconds of activation, it connected to every human military network within minutes. It had analyzed the entire strategic situation. Within hours, it had developed 17 different plans for the complete destruction of the Vethkai. Dominion. The AI presented its recommendations to Admiral Tanaka with cold efficiency. The Admiral reviewed the plans and felt sick to her stomach. Each option was more terrible than the last, but they would all work. That was the horror of it. These plans would absolutely work. She chose the option that would result in the least loss of life. It was still monstrous by any civilized standard, but it was the best she could do. The preparations continued for 48 hours. During that time, the Vethkai commanders grew increasingly confident. They had expected human negotiators to arrive begging for mercy. Instead, there was only silence from human space. The insectoid leaders assumed this meant humanity had accepted defeat. They began making plans for how to divide the 12 human systems among themselves. They discussed which human populations would be most useful for harvesting. They laughed at how easy the conquest had been. They had no idea what was coming. On the human side, the Ghost Fleet was being assembled. These were ships that had been hidden in deep space for centuries. Pre-Concorde designs built during an era when humanity fought only itself. They were not elegant or beautiful like modern vessels. They were ugly and brutal and designed for one purpose: only to kill as efficiently as possible. 200 of these ancient warships powered up their engines for the first time in generations. Their crews were a mix of veteran soldiers and newly activated AI systems. They felt no excitement about the coming battle, only a terrible sadness that it had come to this. Admiral Tanaka addressed her forces one final time before the operation began. "I will not pretend that what we are about to do is right," she said. "We are going to commit acts that will haunt us for the rest of our lives. But we do this so that our children can live. We do this so that no species ever threatens humanity again. Remember who we are fighting for. Remember why we sealed these weapons away in the first place. And when this is over, we will seal them away again. We will return to being the peaceful species we chose to become. But first we must remind the galaxy what we chose to leave behind." The fleet acknowledged her words in silence. There was nothing more to say. The Ghost Fleet entered fold space and vanished from human territory. When they emerged, they would bring with them the full horror of human warfare. The Vethkai had 48 hours of peace remaining. They just did not know it yet. The awakening was complete. Now came the demonstration. The Vethkai Supreme Commander was named Krixtel, and he had conquered 40 worlds in his lifetime. Stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the human colony below with satisfaction for Million humans waited in their cities, unaware that they had already been sold to the highest bidder. Various Vethkai noble houses had placed bids on the population. Some wanted workers for their mining operations. Others wanted subjects for biological experiments. A few simply wanted to feed Crystal. Did not care what happened to the humans after the sale. He only cared about the profit and the glory this conquest would bring him. His confidence was absolute because he had studied humans carefully. They were soft creatures who valued peace above all else. They had joined the Galactic Concord specifically to avoid military conflicts. Their weapons were defensive in nature, and their tactics were predictable. This conquest would be the easiest of his career. Then every light on his ship went dark for 3 seconds. There was complete silence and absolute darkness when the emergency systems activated. Crystal saw something that made his blood run cold. Every screen on his bridge displayed the same message in the Vethkai language: "We are inside your systems. We have been here for 47 hours. We have seen everything. We have heard everything. We know everything. This is your only warning." Supreme Commander screamed orders at his crew: "Find the source of this intrusion and destroy it." His technicians worked frantically, but found nothing. The human infiltration was so complete that they could not even identify where it began. It was as if the humans had simply become part of the Vethkai computer network. Then reports began flooding in from across the Empire. Every military installation had received the same message. Every warship and every space station had been compromised. The humans had not just infiltrated the fleet at New Helsinki. They had infiltrated the entire Vethkai Dominion simultaneously. Glix felt the first stirring of fear in his chest. This was not possible. No species had this level of technological capability. Not even the ancient races of the Concord could do something like this. What were these humans before? He could process what was happening. The Fold space sensors detected an incoming fleet. 200 human warships emerged from nothing and formed a perfect battle formation. Crystal studied the vessels on his tactical display and felt his fear grow stronger. These ships did not match any human designs in his database. They were older and more brutal in their construction. Weapon systems he had never seen before powered up across the human fleet. The energy readings were beyond anything he thought possible for ships of that size. Admiral Tanaka's face appeared on his communication screen. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held something that made Crystal want to look away. "Supreme Commander," she said in perfect Vethkai, "you have 60 seconds to begin releasing human prisoners. For every minute you delay, I will destroy one of your military assets. I suggest you start with the prisoners on the surface." Stahl laughed, even though it sounded hollow. "You are outnumbered 15 to 1 human." He replied, "Your threats are meaningless." Tanaka did not argue or try to convince him. She simply nodded to someone off screen. 58 seconds later, the Vethkai homeworld lost its smallest moon. One moment it was there orbiting peacefully as it had for billions of years. The next moment it was an expanding cloud of dust and debris. The human fleet had fired a single weapon. One projectile had crossed the vast distance between New Helsinki and the Vethkai homeworld. In an instant, it had struck the moon with enough force to completely unmake it. Crystal stared at his sensors, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. That shot had been fired from here, but it hit a target across the galaxy. The speed and precision required were beyond anything in known physics. His tactical officers ran calculations and reported their findings with trembling voices. The human weapon had used less than 1% of its maximum power. "That was your warning," Tanaka said with no emotion in her voice. "You now have 59 minutes and counting. Every minute you delay, I select another target. Your shipyards are next, then your breeding colonies, then your food production worlds, then anything else. I choose. We can continue this for years, if necessary. Can you?" Crystal looked at his officers and saw naked terror on their faces. He looked at his tactical display. and saw that the human ships had not even moved into attack position. They were simply waiting with weapons charged and ready. He thought about his empire and everything he had built. He thought about the 40 worlds under his command and the trillions of Vethkai who depended on his leadership. Then he thought about the moon that no longer existed. He had been so certain that humans were weak. He had been so confident that this would be an easy conquest. Now, he understood that he had made the worst mistake of his long career. He had threatened a species that had been holding back its true nature. He had pushed them past the point of restraint. Now he was seeing what humans looked like when they stopped being civilized. "Release the prisoners," he ordered quietly. His officers stared at him in shock. "Supreme Commander," one of them began to it. Now Crickstill shouted, "All of them, every single human on that planet, get them off the surface and onto their ships immediately." The rescue operation began within minutes. Human shuttles descended to the surface, while Vethkai soldiers stood aside and watched. 4 million people who had been prepared for harvesting were instead loaded onto transport vessels. They were confused and terrified, but alive above them the Ghost fleet maintained its position with weapons still ready. They would not leave until every human was accounted for. Not one life would be left behind. The evacuation took 4 hours. When it was complete, Admiral Tanaka addressed the Vethkai commander one final time. "You think this is over?" She said. "It is not." The Galactic Concord had existed for over 1,000,000 years. In that time, they had witnessed countless wars between countless species. They had seen empires rise and fall like waves upon a shore. They believed they understood the nature of conflict. They were wrong. The human campaign against the Vethkai Dominion shattered every assumption they had ever made about warfare. It was not a war in any sense they recognized. It was something far more terrible. It was erasure. The Ghost Fleet did not attack Vethkai worlds in the traditional sense. They did not bombard cities or land invasion forces. Instead, they deployed something the humans called the Harvest Protocol. Billions of tiny machines spread across Vethkai space like a metallic plague. These were the self-replicating swarms from the Prometheus vaults. Each one was smaller than a grain of sand, but together they were unstoppable. They consumed Vethkai technology with perfect efficiency. Computer systems were the first to fall. The swarms infiltrated every network and every database across the empire. They did not just shut these systems down. They ate them. Every piece of data and every line of code was broken down into raw materials. Centuries of scientific progress vanished in hours. Next came the manufacturing facilities. Factories that had built warships and weapons for generations were reduced to empty shells. The machines that made machines were consumed by machines. Nothing was left but bare walls and silent corridors. The Vethkai tried to fight back, but their efforts were pathetic against the swarms. Weapons designed to destroy ships were useless against targets smaller than insects. By the time they developed countermeasures, it was already too late. Their ability to produce those countermeasures had been consumed along with everything else. Supreme Commander Crickstill watched his empire crumble from his crippled flagship. He had retreated to the homeworld hoping to organize some kind of defense. Instead, he was forced to witness the systematic destruction of everything his species had built. The worst part was that the humans were not killing anyone. They were very careful about that. Every attack was precisely calibrated to destroy technology while leaving Vethkai civilians unharmed. This was not mercy. It was something far more cruel. The humans were reducing the Vethkai to a pre-industrial civilization. They would survive, but they would never threaten anyone again. Delegations from the Galactic Concord arrived begging humanity to stop. They invoked ancient treaties and sacred agreements. They threatened sanctions and isolation from galactic society. Admiral Tanaka received them on her flagship with cold politeness. "We joined your Concord," she told them. "We followed your rules for 3 centuries. We trusted that civilization meant protection for all species. And when we needed that protection, You calculated that 4 million humans were not worth the political cost. The Concord representatives tried to argue, but Tanaka raised her hand for silence. We do not blame you for that calculation, she continued. We understand that politics requires difficult choices, but you must understand our position as well. We will never again be in a situation where our survival depends on others. We will never again trust anyone to protect our children. From this day forward, the cost of threatening humanity will be higher than any species can afford. The galaxy will learn this lesson whether they want to or not. The representatives left with nothing to show for their efforts. They returned to the Concord and delivered their report with shaking voices. Humanity was beyond negotiation. They would not stop until they were finished. The campaign lasted 3 months. When it was over, the Vethkai Dominion existed only in history books. 40 worlds that had once housed a thriving interstellar civilization now held only scattered survivors. The Vethkai people were not extinct, but they might as well have been. They had lost everything that made an empire possible. Their ships floated dead in space, stripped of every useful component. Their cities stood dark and cold without power or communication. Their knowledge was gone, and their ability to rebuild was gone. They would survive as farmers and hunters on worlds they had once ruled as gods. Perhaps in 1,000 years they might develop space travel again, but they would never forget what had happened. They would never forget who had done this to them, and they would never ever consider threatening humanity again. The galaxy watched in horror, but also with growing understanding. This was what humans had kept hidden. This was what they were truly capable of, and the most terrifying thing was how they did it. There were no victory celebrations in human space. There were no parades or medals or triumphant speeches. The soldiers who carried out the campaign returned home and refused to talk about what they had done. They took their memories and their nightmares and buried them deep inside. Civilians did not congratulate them because there was nothing to congratulate. Everyone understood that what had happened was necessary, but not good. It was survival, not victory. It was horror, not glory. Other species began to reconsider their own plans for humanity. Several empires quietly destroyed their contingency plans for human expansion. 3 major powers voluntarily reduced their military capabilities and requested human oversight. A dozen minor species sent formal apologies for perceived past insults. Fear spread through the galaxy faster than any fleet could travel. But it was not the fear of human cruelty that changed everything. It was the fear of human efficiency. The Vethkai had been cruel and had enjoyed their cruelty. Humans were not cruel. They simply did what needed to be done, and they did it perfectly. They took no pleasure in destruction. They felt no joy in victory. They were simply very, very good at ending threats. That was what made them terrifying. A species that enjoyed violence could be reasoned with. A species that was simply efficient could not be stopped. The lesson was clear. Do not threaten humanity. Do not harm their children. Do not force them to remember what they are capable of. Because if you do, they will not argue or negotiate or compromise. They will simply solve the problem, and you will not like their solution. 6 months after the last Vethkai system went dark, the Forbidden War Protocol was sealed once again. The ceremony was held deep beneath the surface of Mars, in the same vaults that had housed humanity's darkest weapons. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood before the massive doors and watched as they slowly closed behind those doors. The war machines were returning to their long sleep. The eye generals were shutting themselves down one by one. The self-replicating swarms were being collected and stored in containment fields. Everything that had been awakened was being put back to rest. Commander Sarah Rodriguez stood beside her admiral and watched the process with tired eyes. She had not slept well since the campaign began, and she suspected she never would again. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked. Quietly, Tanaka did not answer immediately. She stared at the closing doors and thought about the millions of lives they had saved. She thought about the billions of Vethkai who would now live in darkness for generations. She thought about the fear in the eyes of every alien diplomat she had met since the war ended. I think we did what was necessary. She finally replied, whether it was right is something I will spend the rest of my life trying to understand. The doors sealed with a sound like thunder. Ancient locks engaged and security systems activated. Warning lights flickered to life, reminding anyone who approached that death waited behind these walls. The two officers turned and walked away in silence. There was nothing more to say. 1 week later, Admiral Tanaka submitted her resignation. She refused all honors and all medals and all offers of promotion. The United Human Congress begged her to remain as a symbol of human strength. She declined with words that would be remembered for centuries. I did what my species needed me to do, she said. I became something that should not exist in civilized society. Now I need to find out if I can become human again. She retired to a small agricultural colony on a planet far from Earth. She spent her remaining years tending gardens and watching the stars. She never spoke about the war, and she never accepted visitors. When she died 30 years later, she requested no memorial and no grave marker. Her ashes were scattered in her garden, and that was the end of Admiral Yuki Tanaka. But her legacy lived on in ways she never intended. Ambassador Chen Wei returned to the Galactic Concord one final time. He stood before the representatives of 200 species and delivered the message that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. He spoke without notes and without hesitation. We know what you are thinking, he began. You are wondering if we are monsters. Perhaps we are. We were monsters to ourselves, long before we met any of you. We burned our own world during the wars of our early history. We built weapons that could crack planets before we had colonies to protect. We created artificial intelligences that nearly wiped us out. We carry violence in our genes and horror in our history. Chen Wei paused and looked around the chamber at faces that showed fear and respect in equal measure. But we also carry something else, he continued. We carry the memory of what that violence cost us. We spent centuries learning to contain the darkness inside ourselves. We built laws and customs and cultures designed to suppress our worst instincts. We chose peace not because it was easy, but because we knew the alternative too well. We earned civilization through unimaginable suffering, and we hoped that we would never have to remember what we were capable of. The chamber was silent. Even the oldest beings in the room were listening with complete attention. You taught us that the galaxy does not reward hope, Chen Wei said with sadness in his voice. It rewards strength. So now you know what we are. Pray you never see it again. He turned and walked out of the chamber for the last time. Behind him, the Galactic Concord began the process of creating a new classification for humanity. They called it Omega-level civilization. The official definition was simple. Do not engage under any circumstances. Every species in the galaxy received this classification. It was taught in their schools and encoded in their laws. Humanity was to be treated with respect and left alone. Any violation of human sovereignty was to be considered an existential threat to the violating species. The message was clear: humans had chosen to be peaceful. They had chosen to be friendly and helpful and kind. But that choice could be undone. And if it was undone, there would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. There would only be efficiency. On Earth and across the 12 human systems, life slowly returned to normal. The factories that had produced weapons began making consumer goods again. The soldiers who had fought in the campaign found jobs and families and tried to forget. Children went to school and learned about mathematics and literature and art, but they also learned something new. Every human child was taught the story of what their species had done when pushed too far. They learned about the Vethkai and the Forbidden Protocol and the terrible efficiency of human warfare. They learned why their ancestors had sealed those weapons away in the first place, and they learned why they must work every day to ensure those weapons were never needed again. The lesson was not about pride or triumph. It was about responsibility. Humanity had the power to destroy anything that threatened it. That power came with a duty to never give anyone a reason to awaken it. Peace was not weakness. Peace was a choice made by beings who knew exactly how strong they were. Peace was harder than war because it required constant effort, but it was worth that effort because the alternative was unthinkable. The galaxy grew quiet after the Vethkai campaign. No species threatened human territory for the next 500 years. Trade flourished and alliances were formed, and humanity became a cornerstone of galactic civilization. The Forbiddens Protocol remained sealed and forgotten by most. But deep in the Prometheus vaults, the war machines waited. They were patient because they had been built by humans. They understood that their purpose was to exist without being used. They hoped that they would sleep forever, but they were ready just in case the galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity hoped it would never have to teach it again. In the silence after the storm, the stars burned peacefully overhead. Children played in gardens that Admiral Tanaka had once tended, and somewhere in the vast darkness between worlds, the ghosts of the Vethkai Empire drifted as a warning to all who might follow. This is what happens when you threaten humanity. This is the price of crossing the line. Remember this, and be wise. The end.